waited until really started on this and then wrapped it up about a couple hours ago. So it should be the standard quality. But I did bring a bag of goodies just for show and tell. And that's really just to get us warmed up. I guess I'll start with this. So I bought this because I thought it would be cool, not really to use it. It's a little 8-inch Torah scroll from top to bottom. So that means the paper is actually about 5 inches big. And I bought it to be like, that's cool, you can get that. But then I ended up having to use it for today's sermon. I took scans of it to show you a cool fact that I learned while I was researching this portion. And so that's the first part of the slideshow when it gets pulled up. By the way, I want to say thank you to Amy, because every time I make a sermon, I create more work for her by having slides. Thank you for putting up with me. Okay. Awesome. All right. Slide. So here's how it's going to go. We're going to talk about the fun fact that I learned while I was researching. We're going to do a summary of the Parsha. I'm going to talk about an analysis of the Parsha and then a main message of the Parsha. And then that'll be it. Slide. So I learned about something cool in the Torah. You'll notice there's gaps everywhere that you read, and those are used obviously to divide, but I didn't know that there were words for the two things. So there's two kinds. Setuma, which is the version on the left. Those are called closed division gaps. They occur in between lines. And patukas are open division gaps, which are basically like how we do new lines in English. They are gaps that go all the way to the end of the line. And what's cool is that they actually have a purpose to the reason of how long they are. Setumas are used when you have another section that follows the previous section, that the ideas are closely related together, kind of like a semicolon. You'd use the setuma in that case. When you have another section that follows the previous section where the two ideas don't really share any similarities, you'd use a patuka. Or if you're starting an entirely new chapter, you'd use a big division break like the one in between these two sections. Next slide. So Vayetze, this Torah portion, is actually unique in that there are no divisions throughout the entire portion. This is why I was like, hey, it's pretty cool that I was able to do this. I'll bring it for show and tell. I scanned this out of this little 8-inch Torah. It's not high quality enough to be able to read it. A lot of the vowel marks blend together, but it's good enough to show you the structure. Vayetze is basically one uninterrupted chunk of text. It's basically one big run-on paragraph, which is unusual. So I thought I wanted to include it because I figured it out and was like, that's cool. So that's our warm-up. Let's jump into the Parsha summary. So this Torah portion starts with Jacob leaving Beersheba and heading towards Haran to meet Laban and choose his wife. Because he was told by his parents to escape Esau's anger. They were like, hey, let him cool off. You go to Haran for a little bit. And while he's on the way, he basically didn't get to take anything because he left in a hurry. He's basically just walking around with the clothes on his back. He uses a rock as a pillow because it's probably going to get pretty cold in the desert at night. So he'd want to leave his clothes on. He rests his head on the stone and goes to sleep. And while he's sleeping, he dreams of a ladder that ascends from the earth to the heavens, and that angels are going up and down the ladder. I've included this picture of Jacob's ladder that was in the original Luther Bibles from like circa 1530. And I did that mainly because I had art in the last slide, so I figured why not keep with tradition. So next slide. Anointing the stone. While he's dreaming, God renews his covenant that he made with Isaac and says that he's with him. Jacob wakes up and exclaims that truly Adonai is in this place and I didn't know it. And then a little later he says, this place is fearsome. This has to be the house of God. This must be the gate of heaven. I'm pretty sure this is where the first temple gets built later. So he takes the stone that he's rested his head on and he sets it upright and he anoints it with olive oil and he names the place Beit El, which is house of God. And then he continues on his journey towards Haran, which is, I got it here somewhere. It's like 450 miles from Beersheba to Haran as the crow flies. And he's not a crow, so it ended up being a lot longer than as the crow flies. Next slide. So the thunderbolt. So Jacob finally gets to Haran and runs into some of Laban's people or people that know of Laban. And Rachel comes down to bring Laban's sheep to water at the well that's there. And he's awestruck, first sight, and he wants Rachel as his wife. So Jacob tells Rachel that, hey, I'm your cousin, I'm your dad's brother's son or whatever. And I kind of forgot the relation there. Anyway, Rachel goes and tells Laban. Laban meets Jacob, and they realize that they're kin. And so Jacob stays with Laban for about a month and then asks if he can have Rachel as his wife in exchange for 7 years' labor, which was the typical kind of, that was the I don't have any money, but this is the amount of time I'll work. That was the standard amount of time, 7 years. Laban agrees. Jacob works for 7 years, and to him it seems only like a few days because of how madly in love he is with Rachel. 7 years are up, and Laban gathers all the men and held a banquet for Jacob. Next slide. So the night of his wedding, Laban brings Jacob Leah instead of Rachel. Sorry, I'm getting tongue-tied because I'm focusing on my leftover cold symptoms. Anyway, upon realizing this the morning after, he asks Laban why he has been deceived, and Laban states that in our place, that's not how it's done. You got to give the firstborn first, and then the younger daughter later. Rachel was the younger daughter, so that's how that went. Basically, Jacob was deceived for the first time. And then Laban says that Jacob can have Rachel if he finishes the marriage week with Leah, and then works on an additional 7 years for Laban. Jacob agrees, takes Rachel as his wife also, so now he's got two. And Laban gave to his daughters two slave girls, Bilhah and Zilpah. Next slide. So I'm going to cut through quite a few paragraphs of children being born. I've summarized it into these nice tables. Leah had a total of, I think, 7 children, and then both of the slave girls that were for Rachel and Leah both had 2, and then Rachel only had 1, but that was because she was barren for most of the time throughout those 3 paragraphs. And each of their names, which I've included I guess you can call it the phonetic Hebrew name, they all stand for an important particular event, hope, or feeling at the time of the child's birth. So Reuven means see a son, and that was because Adonai saw how humiliated that Leah was and gave her a son. Shimon means hearing because Adonai heard Leah and gave her a son. Gad means good luck because Leah was born another son through Zilpah, so on and so forth. Next slide. So after all the 12 children are born, which I should have said this in the previous slide, these are the 12 tribes of Israel that are being born right around this time. They will become the head of the 12 tribes of Israel later. Excuse me. I'll be glad when the symptoms are gone. Anyway, the 12 children are born. Jacob finished his work for Laban. He's ready to go. He's like, please send me on my way. I want to go back home. Laban has seen how Adonai has blessed Jacob and how he has been blessed through Jacob by Adonai, and he insists that Jacob be paid a wage. Jacob doesn't really want anything, so he tells Laban, tell you what, let me just, out of your flock, let me take all the spotted, striped, and brown animals, sheep and goat. Laban agrees and puts 3 days between himself and Jacob, and when I read this, just plain, I was like, why did he put 3 days between himself and Jacob? Is he setting himself up to get duped? this is actually clarified in the commentary. Rashbam, which is Rashi's son, clarifies that in the verse prior, Laban had actually already separated the speckled and spotted animals from his flock, which he did, and I totally glassed over it. He'd already separated all the speckled and spotted and brown animals from his flock, and it's safe to assume that his flock had grown so large in number because of Jacob that he had to put 3 days distance between the two flocks so that they wouldn't commingle again. So that explains the 3 days. Jacob takes branches from 3 kinds of trees, poplar, almond, and plane trees, and sets them upright in the water so that when the animals drink water, and then because they're at the watering hole, mate, they would inherit the traits from those branches because they made it in the sight of those branches. Slide. I've included pictures of these trees, which something to note, the plane tree is actually really only found in Britain. That's where they're most common, which I thought was kind of weird. So anyway, the poplar trees are both speckled and striped. You can probably see a couple of the black dots down on the bottom of the trunk, and then there's scarred stripes going up the branch. The almond tree is basically just brown. There's no really any cool features. And then the plane tree, the bark kind of likes to fall off in a lot of spots and oxidize. So you get this very spotted tree with a whole bunch of different colors. I thought that was kind of cool to put it in the presentation. Next slide. So Jacob does this for about a day, which is kind of crazy. He grew his flock in multiples in about a day. So he's grown his flock. It's large, it's strong, and he hears Laban's sons just capitulating over. Oh, Jacob has taken everything from our father. Look at how good he's doing. Look at how bad our father's doing. So he kind of sees the smoke on the water, and he's like, it's time to go. And then Adonai actually tells him it's time to go back home, and he was like, yeah, you're right. It's time to go back home. So he gathers his wives, his children, his flock, all his possessions, and he leaves while Laban is 3 days away. And on the way out, Rachel steals Laban's household idols. And then Laban comes back after 3 days and learns that they've left and that his idols are gone, and, he's mad. That's a very relatable feeling to your family's left and they stole something. So he gathers his kinsmen and spends the next 7 days tracking down Jacob. Laban catches up to Jacob and accuses him of stealing his idols, which Jacob doesn't know because Rachel did it without his knowledge. And he says, hey, if you think I stole it, go through everything. If you find anything I've stolen, you can have it back. Laban finds nothing because Rachel keeps moving the idols around. And then, Jacob gets angry because he doesn't know that the idols have been stolen, but he assumes that he hasn't stolen them. So he gets angry at Laban. He starts ranting at him. He goes on this big spiel about how he's been wronged for the past 20 years, how he's been mistreated. And then Laban fires right back with, but these are my sons, these are my daughters, these are my livestock. How can you do this? And they both realize that the back and forth bickering can't be good. So they make a covenant right there where they had met in the hill country of Gilead. Yeah, slide. Thank you. Jacob and Laban make a covenant on a pile of stones that they anoint with oil. They set one stone upright, and then all their kinsmen grabbed a stone and piled it up around it, and they anointed it with oil. Laban calls it Igar Sahaduta, which is pile of witness in Aramaic, and then Jacob calls it Galed, which is pile of witness in Hebrew. They were both saying the same thing in different languages. And in a nutshell, the covenant basically stated that neither of them would cross the boundary established by the stone, so like a big wall, split the continent in half or whatever. If they cross it, they can't be crossing it to harm one another. And, both of them are like, hey, Adonai sees this, the covenant that we're making between each other, so that even if we're doing it by ourselves, he still sees us and we'll still get what's coming to us. And Jacob also vows that to treat Laban's daughters honorably, to put Laban's mind at ease, probably. And the next morning, Laban kisses his sons and daughters and blesses them, and then both parties go on their separate ways. And that's the end of the portion. So pretty much, Jacob had a bad time all around. Throughout the story, he had a lot of bad things befall him, but despite all that, never gave up. He is forced to flee from his home to Haran, which is a bad town, a less than reputable place. And while fleeing, he has to travel alone with no supplies. He's leaving all his family behind. He's probably lonely. He has to work for 7 years to marry the wife he wanted. He's cheated and has to marry someone he didn't want to. He has to work another 7 years to finally marry Rachel. During the time he works for Laban, Laban changes his wages 10 times, which we don't find out until he starts ranting at Laban right at the end of the portion. Sorry. His relationship with Laban deteriorates so much that he thinks he needs to leave in secret. He was paranoid around Laban. He thought Laban was just out to get him. Jacob's strength throughout the whole story comes from his faith, and it never let him waver in the face of adversity. He didn't really worry about, he wondered about how he was going to prosper in this place, but he never worried about not being able to prosper in this place. He recognized that God had led him to this place and that he was there for a reason. And rather than feel defeated and give up, he just kept going. Which leads us to what I think the main theme of the portion is, and it's that as long as you walk the path that is laid out for you by Adonai, there is no need to worry. Much like how Jacob does throughout the whole story. He struggles against Laban, deceiving and manipulating him, yet still prospers as Adonai provides for him. And it also shows that walking the path requires active participation. You can't be given a map and not walk the path that's on the map and expect it to make your destination. You know what I mean? He worked tirelessly for Laban. He had to strategize to grow his own flocks, and he prayed and acknowledged Adonai's hand in his success constantly. Next slide. So you also have to forget the self sometimes, as Jacob had to do several times throughout the portion. He could have made a big deal about, having to marry Leah instead of wanting to marry Rachel. And he could have just said, I'm out. I'm done with this. And he didn't. He could have thrown a fit when he needed to work another 7 years, saying, hey, I've already worked for you 7 years. What's this deal about me having to work another 7? And then even after being accused of stealing his gods, Laban's gods, sorry, I should have. Anyway, after being tongue-tied, after being accused of stealing Laban's gods, he did not immediately get angry at Laban and entertained the idea that maybe he did. He lets Laban go through his things. And only after Laban looks through all his things and finds that his idols aren't there does he get angry. While faith in the path alleviates worry, Jacob reminds us that we're co-partners in the divine in shaping our journey. It's not just trust and just effort. It's about trust and effort working together. Shabbat Shalom.